The ship was small, and that was the first thing they noticed. It came through the orbital gate like a pebble tossed into an ocean, surrounded on all sides by warships the size of mountains and trade vessels that stretched across the horizon of space like floating cities. The Sci-Fi Dominion had ruled 400 star systems for over 9,000 years, and in all that time, no species had ever sent a vessel so unremarkable to the throne world. Inside that small ship sat Captain Aiden Voss, a 34-year-old human male with dark hair, tired eyes, and a calm that unsettled most people who met him. He wore a simple gray uniform with Earth's emblem stitched on the shoulder, a pale blue circle crossed with silver lines. No medals, no royal sash, no powered armor. Just a man in a chair, watching through the viewport as the throne world of the Sci-Fi Dominion filled his entire field of vision. The planet was called Vathari, and it glowed like a living jewel, deep violet oceans, silver forests, and cities that rose from the surface like crystalline spines reaching toward the heavens. Aiden let out a slow breath and whispered to no one, "Here we go." When his ship docked at the Imperial platform, a delegation of Sci-Fi courtiers was already waiting, though waiting was a generous word for what they were doing. They stood in a perfect line, their tall and elegant forms draped in layered robes of light that shifted color with every movement. The Sci-Fi were beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, sharp, precise, and dangerous. They averaged 8 feet in height, with skin like polished silver and eyes that burned in shades of gold and violet. Their faces were narrow and angular, their movements impossibly smooth, as though gravity was merely a suggestion they sometimes chose to follow. Aiden stepped off his ship and looked up at the nearest courtier, who gazed down at him the way one might look at a stray animal that had wandered into a palace. "You are the human envoy?" the courtier asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "That is correct," Aiden replied, his tone even and unhurried. "We expected someone more," another courtier murmured, not even bothering to hide the disdain. Aiden simply nodded and said, "I get that a lot." They led him through corridors of light and glass, past towering statues of ancient Sci-Fi rulers, past gardens where flowers floated in the air without soil or water, past windows that looked out onto a sky filled with ships and stations, and the faint shimmer of a planetary shield. Everything about the Sci-Fi Dominion was designed to make a visitor feel small, and it worked, but Aiden walked through it all with the same steady pace, the same quiet expression, as though he had seen wonders before and had learned that wonder alone could not save anyone. The Grand Throne Hall was a cathedral of crystal and starlight. It stretched so high that clouds actually formed near the ceiling, drifting between pillars that rose like the bones of a god. At the far end sat a throne carved from a single piece of black stone that seemed to absorb light itself. And upon it sat Empress Vorthia. She was magnificent in a way that made the word feel insufficient. Even among the Sci-Fi, she was extraordinary, 9 feet tall with skin like liquid moonlight and eyes that held the deep, burning violet of a dying star. Her hair flowed like silver water down her shoulders and pooled around the throne like a river of light. She wore armor, not robes, not gowns, but actual battle armor forged from a metal that hummed faintly with energy. She was not merely a ruler who sat and gave orders. She was a warrior who had conquered systems with her own hands. And right now she was bored. She watched the human approach with the same mild interest one might give to an insect landing on a windowsill. Around her, the court was filled with representatives from dozens of species, tall, armored Kethrani warriors, the floating, luminescent Valith scholars, the massive stone-bodied Goreth traders, all of them turning to watch this small, soft creature walk toward the most powerful being in the known galaxy. Aiden stopped at the designated line, 20 paces from the throne, and bowed not deeply, not submissively, but with the respectful nod of one equal greeting another. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the court. The Empress raised one hand, and silence fell like a hammer. "You are Earth's offering," she asked, and her voice was low and smooth, carrying through the hall without effort. "I am Earth's envoy, Your Majesty," Aiden replied, "and I bring a tribute from my world." "Then present it." Aiden reached into his coat and pulled out a small silver device, a data core no bigger than his fist. He held it up, and a courtier hurried forward to take it and present it to the Empress. She looked at it the way a mountain looks at a pebble. "What is this?" "Everything," Aiden said simply. "It contains the complete biological and historical record of Earth, every plague we survived, every extinction we endured, every failed experiment and every success, every adaptation our species has made across 200,000 years of existence." The court erupted in quiet laughter. A Keithrani warlord near the front snorted and growled. "They send us a library. While worlds burn under the silence, the humans send us stories." Others joined in, their mockery filling the hall like a slow poison. But Aiden did not flinch, did not react, did not look away from the Empress. And the Empress, though she showed nothing on her face, did not laugh either. She studied the human for a long, quiet moment, the way a predator studies something it cannot quite identify. Then she waved her hand dismissively and said, "Your tribute is noted, human. You may retire to the guest quarters. We will summon you if you are needed." Aiden bowed again with that same calm nod and turned to leave. As he walked back through the hall, past the sneering courtiers and the amused diplomats, not a single person in that room thought they would ever see him again. But deep in the Imperial Science Spire, a Savari scientist named Counselor Draven had already begun scanning the data core, and what he found made his hands tremble. Because buried inside that tiny archive was something no species in the galaxy had ever produced, proof that life on Earth had been nearly destroyed 5 separate times across its history, and every single time it had come back stronger. The plagues, the ice ages, the asteroid strikes, the volcanic winters, Earth's biosphere had been shattered again and again, and yet it rebuilt itself with a ferocity that defied every known model of biological survival. And humanity itself, these small, soft, short-lived creatures, carried within their very blood a record of adaptation so dense and so fierce that Draven could barely believe what he was reading. He sat back in his chair, staring at the data streaming across his screens, and for the first time in his long career, the old scientist felt something he had not felt in decades. Hope. Because the silence, the blight that was killing worlds across the Dominion, the plague that no species had been able to cure, had finally met something that might be able to fight it. And that something had just walked into the palace in a gray uniform, with tired eyes and no medals, and had been laughed out of the throne room. Counselor Draven had not slept in 3 days. He stood in the center of his laboratory, surrounded by floating screens of data that spun slowly around him like the rings of a planet, and every single one of them told him the same impossible thing. The human archive was not a gift, it was a miracle wrapped in humility. He had spent decades studying the silence, the blight that crept from world to world like a slow and invisible fire, killing everything it touched, not with violence but with stillness. It simply stopped life from continuing, turning vibrant ecosystems into gray and silent wastelands where nothing grew and nothing breathed and nothing moved. Every species in the Dominion had tried to fight it. The Keithrani had tried to burn infected worlds clean. The Valeth had tried to rewrite the molecular structure of the blight. The Goreth had tried to wall off entire star systems, and none of it had worked. The silence adapted, just as life adapts, but faster and more ruthlessly than anything Draven had ever seen. And yet, when he ran Earth's biological data through his models, something extraordinary happened. The human biosphere did not collapse under the simulated exposure to the silence. It fought back. Not immediately, not cleanly, not without tremendous loss. But it fought back the way a forest fights back after a fire, the way a wound fights infection, the way a river carves through stone given enough time and enough stubborn persistence. The key was not in any single organism or any single gene. It was in the sheer density of adaptive mechanisms packed into Earth's biology, layer upon layer of survival coding, built up over billions of years of relentless, catastrophic, world-ending challenges that would have killed any other biosphere permanently. Earth was not a paradise. It was a war zone that had learned to turn scars into armor. Draven requested an emergency audience with the Empress, and he got one. He found her in her private war chamber, a dark room at the heart of the palace where maps of the Dominion floated in the air like ghostly constellations, and the dying worlds glowed red like open wounds scattered across the stars. She stood with her back to him, her silver hair flowing over her armor, her hands clasped behind her, staring at the map the way a captain stares at a sinking ship. "Speak," she said without turning. Draven told her everything, the data, the simulations, the impossible resilience coded into human biology, and when he finished, the Empress was silent for a very long time. Then she said, "Bring me the human." They found Aiden in the guest quarters, a small, plain room that was luxurious by human standards, but practically an insult by Scifistories ones. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, reading something on a small tablet, and when the guards arrived to summon him, he simply stood up and said, "Lead the way." This time, there was no grand hall, no audience of sneering courtiers, just a quiet room with a table and 2 chairs, and the Empress of the Scifistories Dominion sitting across from a human who barely reached her shoulder. She studied him the way she had before, with those deep violet eyes that seemed to see through skin and bone and straight into the marrow of a person. "Your data," she began, "is remarkable." "Thank you, Your Majesty." "I did not say that as a compliment. I said it because it confuses me," she continued, leaning forward slightly. "Every species in my dominion has faced extinction at most once, and most did not survive it without intervention from a stronger civilization. Your world has faced it 5 times, and you survived every one of them alone." Aiden nodded slowly. "How?" she asked, and the question was not casual. It was desperate, though she hid it well behind her imperial mask. Aiden was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was steady but heavy, as though the words carried weight that most people could not see. "We did not survive because we were the strongest," he said. "We were never the strongest. There were always bigger predators, harsher climates, faster diseases. We were small and soft and fragile, and the universe seemed to take a personal interest in trying to kill us." He paused, then continued. "We survived because we refused to accept that we were finished. When the ice came, we learned to make fire. When the plagues came, we learned to make medicine. When the asteroid killed the giants, we crawled out of our holes and inherited a broken world and built something new on top of the wreckage." The Empress listened without moving, without blinking, her entire focus locked onto this small creature who spoke of apocalypse with the calm familiarity of someone discussing the weather. "It was never pretty," Aiden went on. "We lost billions along the way, entire civilizations rose and fell and were forgotten. Languages and cultures and peoples vanished like smoke, and every time it happened, the survivors had to find a reason to keep going when every rational calculation said they should not have bothered." He looked her in the eyes, those ancient, burning, violet eyes, and said, "The secret is not strength, Your Majesty. The secret is stubbornness. The secret is that somewhere in our blood, in the very code of what makes us human, there is something that simply will not stop." The room was very quiet. The Empress sat back in her chair, and for a fraction of a moment, so brief that Aiden almost missed it, something shifted behind her eyes, something that looked like recognition, like the sudden discovery that you are not the only one carrying an impossible weight. She masked it quickly, of course. She was an empress, and empresses did not show vulnerability to strangers. But her voice was softer when she spoke next. I am assigning you to Counselor Draven's research team as a liaison. You will have full access to the Science Spire and to any resources you require. Thank you, Your Majesty. Do not thank me, she said, standing, her full height towering over him like a silver monument. Prove that your species is worth what your data suggests. She turned to leave, and Aiden stood as well. Your Majesty, he called, and she stopped but did not turn. The silence is killing your worlds the way extinction events killed ours, slowly, ruthlessly, without mercy. But I want you to know something. She waited. We have seen this before. Not this exact enemy, not this exact fight, but the shape of it, the weight of it, the feeling of watching everything you love die and not knowing if anything you do will matter. He let the silence sit for a moment, then said, We are still here, and when this is over, your people will be too. The Empress did not respond. She simply walked away, her silver hair trailing behind her like a comet's tail. But Aiden noticed something as she left. Her hands, which had been clasped tightly behind her back the entire conversation, had finally relaxed. In the weeks that followed, Aiden became a fixture in the Science Spire, working alongside Counselor Draven and a team of Scifistories biologists who initially treated him with barely concealed contempt. He did not argue with them, did not demand respect, did not try to prove himself through words. He simply worked, hour after hour, day after day, offering insights from Earth's history of disease and adaptation that the Scifistories scientists had never considered because they had never needed to. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to listen. And slowly, something even more remarkable happened. The Empress began visiting the laboratory. At first it was brief and official, a quick inspection accompanied by guards and advisors. But over time the visits grew longer, the guards stood farther away, and the questions she asked became less about the research and more about Earth, about humanity, about the strange and stubborn species that had crawled out of the mud of one small planet and somehow carried within them the code to save an empire. She never admitted that she was curious. She never admitted that she found the human interesting. She never admitted that for the first time in decades, she looked forward to something. But Draven noticed. And when the old scientist saw the Empress laugh, actually laugh, a sound so rare that most of her court had never heard it, at something the human said about a creature called a tardigrade, Draven smiled to himself and quietly returned to his work. Because hope, he had learned, often arrived in forms that no one expected. And sometimes it arrived in a gray uniform, with tired eyes and no medals, carrying nothing but a small silver device and the entire stubborn history of a species that simply refused to die. The news spread like wildfire across the Dominion. The human data was working. On a small border world called Thenar IV, a world that had been gray and dead for 2 years under the silence, the first green shoots had broken through the ashen soil. It was not much. A few clusters of regrown plant life, a handful of insects stirring in the newly warmed air, microorganisms multiplying in water that had been sterile for months. But it was life, and in a galaxy that had been watching its worlds die one by one, even a handful of green shoots was enough to change everything. Counselor Draven's team had synthesized a bioagent using genetic material derived from Earth's extremophile organisms, tiny creatures that thrived in boiling water, freezing ice, crushing pressure, and toxic acid. And that bioagent had done what no Scifistories technology had managed in a decade of trying. It had pushed back against the silence, and the silence had retreated. The throne world erupted in celebration, but the celebration did not last long, because in the shadows of the Dominion, something far older and far more dangerous than the silence was stirring. Politics. Within days of the breakthrough, 3 of the most powerful vassal species in the Dominion, the Keithrani, the Gorath, and the Valith, announced the formation of what they called the Sovereign Coalition, and their demands were simple and devastating. The Empress must step down, or she must take a consort from among the coalition's chosen candidates, binding her throne to their power and giving them authority over the Dominion's future. It was an ultimatum dressed in tradition, because the Sevari had an ancient law. A ruler who sat the throne alone for too long was considered incomplete, a monarch without legacy, a branch without fruit, and the coalition had seized upon this law like wolves seizing upon a wounded animal. She has ruled alone for 300 years, the Keithrani warlord Brenax declared before the assembled court, his massive armored form casting a shadow over half the room. The law is clear. A ruler without a consort is a ruler without a future. The Dominion deserves stability, and stability requires partnership. What he meant, of course, was that the Dominion deserved to be carved up among the coalition's leaders, and partnership meant control. The Empress sat on her throne and listened to these demands with a face carved from stone, but Aiden, who stood among the lower-ranked observers at the back of the hall, could see the tension in her hands, the way her fingers gripped the armrests of the throne just slightly too hard. She was trapped and she knew it. If she refused the consort demand, the coalition would use the ancient law to challenge her legitimacy, and the species that were still loyal to her might waver. If she accepted, she would be forced to choose from a list of candidates that the coalition had carefully selected, warlords and princes who would demand territory, military control, and political dominance in exchange for the marriage, reducing her from an empress to a puppet. Either way, the Dominion as she had built it would end. The court session dissolved into chaos, factions arguing, ambassadors shouting, alliances shifting by the hour, and through it all, Aiden watched in silence, studying the players and the game with the same quiet intensity that had carried him through every crisis in his life. That evening, he was summoned to the Empress's private chamber, not the war room, not the throne hall, but her actual living quarters, a place so private that even most of her senior advisors had never seen it. It was surprisingly simple: a large window looking out at the stars, a few pieces of elegant furniture, shelves lined with what appeared to be handwritten books in a language older than most civilizations, and a single chair where the Empress sat without her armor for the first time since Aiden had arrived. Without the armor, she looked different, not smaller, because nothing could make a 9-foot being of silver light look small, but somehow more real, more present, as though the armor had been a wall and she had finally stepped out from behind it. "They will destroy everything I have built," she said, and her voice was quiet, stripped of the imperial authority she wore like a second skin. Aiden stood near the window, his reflection ghosting across the glass alongside the stars. "What are your options?" he asked. "I have none," she said. "Every candidate the coalition offers will hollow out the throne from the inside. They do not want a partner, they want a leash." And refusing. Refusing means civil war, and in our current state, with the silence still consuming our outer worlds, a civil war would shatter the Dominion beyond repair. Billions would die not from the blight, but from the chaos. Aiden was quiet for a long moment, then said, "There is always another option. You just cannot see it yet because you are looking at this through their rules." She turned her gaze on him, sharp and searching. "And what would a human know about ruling an empire?" "Nothing," he admitted freely. "But I know a few things about surviving when the rules are designed to make you lose." Before she could respond, an urgent message arrived from Counselor Draven. The coalition had made a new move, one that changed everything. They had sent a formal demand to Earth's Stellar Council, claiming that since the cure for the silence was derived from human biology, the Dominion had a sovereign right to secure the source, which was a polite way of saying they intended to take control of Earth itself, by force if necessary. Aiden read the message, And for the first time since arriving on the throne world, his calm cracked just for a moment, just a flash of something fierce and bright behind his tired eyes, before he sealed it away again. "They are threatening my world," he said, his voice level but edged with something that made the Empress look at him more carefully. "They are threatening everything," she replied. "Your world, my empire, the cure itself. If the Coalition seizes control, they will hoard the bioagent and use it as leverage over every species in the galaxy. Worlds will die not because we lack the cure, but because the powerful will decide who deserves to live." Aiden looked out at the stars, at the vast, cold, beautiful expanse of space that held within it both the best and worst of what intelligent life could create. "Then we do not let them," he said. "How?" she asked, and the question was raw and unguarded in a way that she had never allowed herself to be in front of anyone. "I do not know yet," Aiden said honestly, "but I know this: every time my species has faced a moment like this, a moment where the powerful tried to crush the rest of us under their boot, someone stood up and said no. It was not always the strongest person or the smartest person or the person with the most resources. Sometimes it was just someone stubborn enough to plant their feet and refuse to move." He turned from the window and looked at her, really looked at her, not as an empress or an alien or a being of impossible power, but as a person standing at the edge of a cliff and trying to find a reason not to fall. "You are not alone in this," he said. And the Empress of the Sivari Dominion, who had ruled alone for 3 centuries, and had never once allowed herself the weakness of leaning on another living soul, felt something inside her shift. A wall she had built so long ago that she had forgotten it was even there, developing its first crack. She said nothing in response, but she did not look away. And that night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lyrene Vorthia did not dream of dying worlds and failing empires. She dreamed of green shoots breaking through gray soil and a quiet voice saying, "We are still here." 3 days passed, and the Dominion held its breath. The Coalition had set a deadline. The Empress had 1 week to announce her chosen consort, or they would invoke the ancient right of removal, stripping her of the throne by force of law and tradition. Every species in the galaxy was watching, and the court had become a nest of whispers and conspiracies, with factions forming and breaking apart by the hour like waves crashing against a shore that was slowly crumbling. Aiden spent those 3 days in the Science Spire, working with Draven to accelerate production of the bioagent, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over the problem of the Coalition again and again like a puzzle box with no visible seams. On the 4th day, the Empress summoned him to her war chamber. She was standing when he arrived, her armor back in place, her face once again the mask of imperial authority. But Aiden had seen what was behind the mask now, and he could read the tension in the way she held herself, the way her jaw was set just a fraction too tight, the way her eyes burned not with confidence but with the kind of fire that comes from refusing to show fear. The door sealed behind him, and they were alone. "I have exhausted every option," she said without greeting, without preamble, her voice flat and precise. "Draven has confirmed that the bioagent works, but full deployment will take years. We do not have years. The Coalition will move within days, and when they do, the cure dies with my throne." She turned to face him fully, and in that moment, she was not an empress addressing an envoy. She was a woman asking for help from the only person she trusted enough to be honest with her. "I need a consort," she said, and the words clearly cost her something, because her voice tightened on each one as though she were pulling them from somewhere deep and painful. "The law demands it, the Coalition demands it, and the survival of the Dominion demands it." Aiden listened without interrupting. "I have considered asking Earth's Stellar Council to send someone of rank, a general, a president, a leader of sufficient standing to satisfy the political requirements," she continued. "If the consort is human, the Coalition cannot claim the cure without also claiming the throne, which binds their hands. A human consort would protect both Earth and the Dominion. She paused, and her voice became quieter. I am asking you to carry this message to your leaders. I am asking you to find me someone worthy. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the ships passing outside the window and the distant murmur of the palace's energy systems. Aiden stood very still, his hands at his sides, his expression unreadable, and then something changed in his eyes, something that was not calculation or diplomacy, but something far older and far simpler. He took a slow breath and spoke. You do not need a general, he said, his voice quiet but firm. You do not need a president or a commander or someone with a title long enough to fill a page. The Empress frowned slightly, uncertainty flickering across her features. What you need, Aiden continued, is someone who will stand beside you, not above you, not behind you, not as a symbol or a tool or a political arrangement, but beside you as an equal, carrying the same weight, facing the same storm. He stepped forward one step, just one, but in that room, in that moment, it felt like crossing an ocean. You need someone who will not flinch when the galaxy pushes back, someone who will not try to take your power or diminish your authority, someone who understands that being your partner does not mean owning you. It means choosing to share the burden because it is the right thing to do. The Empress stared at him, and her mask slipped, not completely, not dramatically, but enough that Aiden could see the raw and ancient loneliness that lived behind those violet eyes, the loneliness of a being who had carried a galaxy on her shoulders for 300 years and had never once been allowed to set it down. There is no one like that, she whispered, and the words were not an argument, they were a confession. Aiden held her gaze. Then I will be your husband. The Empress went completely still. Not the stillness of shock, not the stillness of offense or surprise or disbelief, but the stillness of someone who has just heard the one thing they never expected to hear, the one thing they had stopped believing was possible, spoken aloud by the one person in the entire galaxy who meant it without condition or agenda. The silence in the room was so deep and so complete that Aiden could hear his own heartbeat. He did not look away. He did not waver. He did not add conditions or qualifications or escape clauses. He simply stood there, a small and fragile human in a gray uniform with no medals, offering himself to the most powerful being in the known galaxy, not as a conqueror, not as a savior, not as a political pawn, but as a partner. You are serious, she said, and it was not a question. I have never been more serious about anything in my life, he replied. You understand what this means. You would be bound to the throne of the Dominion, bound to me, to my people, to wars that are not yours and enemies that would see you dead before they accept a human at my side. I understand. You would leave your world behind, your home, your people, your life as you know it. My world will be safer with me here than with me there. You would be mocked, hated, challenged. Every species in the coalition will see you as an insult, a provocation, a target. I have been underestimated my entire life, Your Majesty. It has never stopped me before. She searched his face for any sign of doubt, any crack in his resolve, any hint of the fear that she knew, she absolutely knew, must be living somewhere inside him, because no sane creature could stand where he stood and feel nothing. But all she found was that quiet, steady, stubborn certainty that she had first noticed when he walked into her throne room and bowed like an equal. And in that moment, something inside Lyrene Vorthia broke, not in the way things break when they are destroyed, but in the way a dam breaks when the water behind it has grown too powerful to contain. She had ruled alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be chosen, not for her throne, not for her power, not for the advantage she could provide, but simply because someone looked at her and decided that she was worth standing beside. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, the violet fire in her gaze was not dimmed but changed, brighter, steadier, like a star that has finally found its orbit. Then it is done, she said, and her voice carried the weight of empires and the lightness of something that might, in time, become hope. The announcement shattered the galaxy. A human, a member of the youngest, smallest, most fragile species in the Dominion, as royal consort to Empress Lyrene Vorthia. The coalition erupted in fury. Brenax the Keithrani warlord called it an abomination. The Gorath demanded an emergency session of the Grand Court, and the Valeth scholars declared that the Union violated 1,000 years of precedent. On Earth, the Stellar Council stared at each other in stunned silence, unable to decide whether Aiden Voss was the bravest human who had ever lived or the most insane. The galactic networks blazed with debate, outrage, admiration, and disbelief. A storm of voices arguing over whether this was genius or madness, sacrifice or suicide, love or politics. And in the middle of all of it, in a quiet room in the Imperial Palace, Aiden Voss sat alone and stared at his hands. They were shaking. Not because he regretted what he had done. He did not for a single moment. But because he was human, and humans feel fear, and the weight of what he had just committed to was enough to crush anyone who allowed themselves to feel the full measure of it. But he did what humans have always done when the weight becomes unbearable. He took a deep breath, steadied his hands, and stood up. Because there was work to do, and the galaxy was not going to save itself. The coalition responded exactly as Aiden expected, with rage, and then with strategy. Within 2 days of the announcement, Brenax the Keithrani warlord invoked the right of dominance, an ancient Sevari tradition that had not been used in over 1,000 years, but had never been removed from law. The right was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Any consort who had not proven themselves worthy before the assembled leaders of the Dominion could be challenged, and the challenge could not be refused. If the consort failed, the marriage was annulled, the Empress was deposed, and the coalition would carve up the Dominion among themselves like vultures tearing apart a carcass. The trials were designed for the strongest species in the galaxy, beings that could shatter stone with their bare hands, beings that could survive in the vacuum of space, beings that had been bred for war across millennia of evolution. They were not designed for humans. The entire galaxy knew this, and the entire galaxy tuned in to watch, because whether they supported the human or despised him, everyone wanted to see what would happen when the smallest species in the Dominion stood before the largest and was told to prove its worth. The trials were held in the Arena of Ascension, an enormous open-air coliseum on the throne world that could seat 1 million spectators, and had been the site of coronations, executions, and legendary battles for 9,000 years. When Aiden walked onto the floor of the arena, the silence that greeted him was worse than any mockery. It was the silence of a crowd that had already decided the outcome. He was wearing light combat gear, human-made, practical, nothing flashy, and he carried no weapon, because the right did not allow weapons in the first trial. The Empress watched from the royal box, her face carved from ice, her hands gripping the railing with enough force to bend metal, because she could not help him, could not intervene, could not do anything except watch the man who had chosen to carry her burden walk into a gauntlet that had broken beings 10 times his size. The first trial was endurance. They locked Aiden in a chamber and exposed him to conditions that simulated the harshest environments in the Dominion: freezing cold, crushing pressure, searing heat, toxic atmosphere, cycling through each one in rapid succession, while the crowd watched his vitals on enormous floating screens. A Keithrani warrior would have powered through on raw biology. A Gorath would have endured through sheer mass. A Valeth would have adapted their molecular structure. Aiden had none of those advantages. But he had something the crowd did not expect: training, preparation, and the accumulated survival knowledge of a species that had been fighting hostile environments since before they could walk upright. He controlled his breathing, regulated his body temperature through techniques that human soldiers and explorers had developed over centuries. And when the pain became unbearable, he did what humans do. He found a place inside his mind where the pain was just information, just data, just another problem to solve, and he endured. He came out of the chamber bleeding from his nose, shaking, barely able to stand, but he was standing. The crowd stirred. The second trial was combat. They sent a Keithrani champion against him, a massive, armored warrior named Torvax who stood over 10 feet tall and had killed enemies with single blows. Aiden could not match Torvax in strength. That was obvious to everyone, including Aiden. So he did not try. Instead, he fought the way humans have always fought when outmatched, with speed, with intelligence, with misdirection, with an almost supernatural ability to read an opponent's movements and be somewhere else when the blow landed. He let Torvax swing and miss, let the giant exhaust himself chasing a target that was never where he expected, let frustration build until frustration became sloppiness and sloppiness became openings. And when the opening came, Aiden struck, not at Torvax's armored chest or his reinforced skull, but at the joint behind his knee, a tiny gap in the armor that no Keithrani would have known to target because no Keithrani had ever needed to fight something smaller and more desperate than themselves. Torvax went down on one knee, and before he could rise, Aiden was behind him with his arm locked around the giant's throat in a hold that used Torvax's own weight against him. The Keithrani champion tapped the ground 3 times, the signal of surrender. The arena erupted, not in cheers, not yet, but in something louder and more powerful, disbelief. The third trial was strategy. They placed Aiden before a tactical simulation, a holographic war game that recreated a famous battle from the Dominion's history, a battle that had been studied in every military academy across 100 worlds. He had never seen it before, had no knowledge of the forces involved or the terrain or the historical outcome. But he had something that the designers of the trial had not accounted for: a human mind, a mind shaped by a species that had been waging wars of infinite complexity against each other and against nature for 200,000 years, a species that had invented strategy, deception, sacrifice plays, flanking maneuvers, guerrilla warfare, and 1,000 other tactical innovations born from the desperate necessity of being the weakest creature on a world full of predators. Aiden won the simulation in 11 minutes. The historical commanders who had actually fought the battle had taken 3 days. The crowd was no longer silent. But the final trial, the declaration, was the one that truly mattered. Aiden stood in the center of the arena, alone, with no armor and no weapon and no shield, with 1,000,000 spectators staring down at him, and the leaders of every species in the Dominion watching from their diplomatic boxes. The rite required him to make a public declaration, to state before the galaxy why he was worthy of standing beside the Empress, why a human deserved the throne of the most powerful empire in existence. Brenax leaned forward in his box, confident that this was where the human would fail, because what could a soft, short-lived, insignificant creature possibly say that would convince a galaxy of ancient civilizations that he belonged among them? Aiden looked up at the crowd, took a slow breath, and began to speak. "I am not the strongest being in this arena," he said, his voice clear and steady, amplified across the entire Colosseum. "I am not the fastest or the oldest or the most powerful. By every measure that this galaxy uses to judge worth, I should not be here." He paused, letting the words settle. "But I am here, and I am here because 10,000 years ago, the first humans looked up at the stars and decided that they wanted to go there. Not because they could, not because it was safe, not because anyone told them they were allowed, but because something inside them refused to accept that the sky was the limit." His voice grew stronger, not louder but deeper, carrying a resonance that had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with conviction. My species has fought for every single day of its existence. We have buried our dead in numbers that would make the oldest civilizations weep, and every single time we got back up. Not because we are special, not because we are chosen, not because some prophecy or destiny told us we mattered, but because we decided, over and over again, that living was worth the pain. He turned slowly, addressing every section of the arena. I did not come here to conquer. I did not come here to rule. I came here because a woman who has carried the weight of a galaxy alone for 300 years asked for help, and I could not. I would not walk away from that. He looked up at the royal box, where the Empress sat with tears she would never acknowledge shining in her violet eyes. I am not worthy of her throne, no one is, but I am worthy of standing beside her because I choose to. Not for power, not for glory, not for survival, but because that is what humans do. When someone we care about is standing at the edge, we do not calculate the cost or measure the odds. We reach out our hand and we say, "You are not alone." The arena was completely silent, a million beings holding their breath. You can mock us for being small. You can despise us for being young. You can underestimate us for being fragile, and you would not be the first, and you will not be the last. But hear me now, all of you. His voice rang out across the Colosseum like a bell. We do not break. The silence lasted for 3 heartbeats. Then the arena exploded, not with the polite applause of diplomats or the grudging acknowledgement of politicians, but with a roar that shook the foundations of the Colosseum, a sound that came from beings of 100 different species who had just witnessed something that transcended biology and politics and ancient rivalry. They had witnessed a human being exactly what humans are, stubborn, brave, terrified, and utterly unwilling to let that terror win. The Coalition's challenge collapsed that day, not because Aiden defeated them in combat or outsmarted them in strategy, but because he made their cynicism look small in the face of something they had no weapon against: sincerity. The coronation took place 3 days later, in the Grand Throne Hall, beneath the clouds that drifted between crystal pillars. Aiden stood beside the Empress in a simple gray suit. He had refused the ornate robes they offered. And when the ancient words were spoken and the bond was sealed, the Empress took his hand in hers, her silver fingers wrapping around his small, human ones with a gentleness that surprised everyone who knew her. Aiden's first act as royal consort was to insist that the cure for the silence be distributed freely to every world in the Dominion, without cost and without condition, including the worlds of the Coalition. If we hoard the cure, he told the court, we become exactly what they accused us of being. If we give it freely, we become something they cannot argue with. The motion passed unanimously, because no one in that room, not even Brennax, could bring themselves to argue against the man who had just given a speech that half the galaxy was already memorizing. Earth's status was elevated from vassal territory to full allied sovereignty, and for the first time in galactic history, a human sat at the right hand of the most powerful throne in existence. That evening, after the ceremonies and the speeches and the endless diplomatic handshakes, Aiden and Lyrene stood together on the balcony of the Imperial Palace, looking out at the stars. The sky was vast and dark and filled with light, and somewhere out there, on 100 worlds, green things were growing where gray ash had been. "Are you afraid?" Lyrene asked, her voice soft, stripped of ceremony. Aiden smiled, a real smile, tired and honest and full of something that looked remarkably like peace. "I have always been afraid," he said. "That has never stopped us before." She looked at him, this small, impossible, stubborn human who had walked into her empire with nothing and had somehow become the thing she needed most. And for the first time in 300 years, the Empress of the Sevari Dominion reached out and took someone's hand, not as a ruler, not as a warrior, not as a symbol, but as a woman who had finally, after centuries of silence, found someone willing to stand beside her and share the weight. They stood together on the balcony, hand in hand, two beings from worlds that could not have been more different, watching the stars burn in the endless dark. And the galaxy, for all its vastness and all its cruelty and all its ancient, indifferent silence, felt just a little bit smaller. Because somewhere in the dark, a light had been lit, not by the strongest or the oldest or the most powerful, but by a species that had crawled out of the mud of one tiny world and had carried within them, from the very beginning, the one thing the universe could never extinguish: the stubborn, unbreakable, impossibly human refusal to face the darkness alone.